When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. When we think mental health, more often than not, in our minds, these words are directly linked to illness, mental illness, and planted with a negative connotation. While physical health, more often than not, is processed with much more neutrality. Through sharing, storytelling, and raw conversation, together we can inspire across communities the notion of embracing an alternative, which I have reframed as mental beauty. The next way to see mental health. Take in the beauty, lessons, learnings, and owning that it is as much part of each of our lives as every other aspect of health and wellness. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 2. What people don't know about Khatna, its secrecy, and propagation. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. So I introduce to you our guest, Farzana Doctor, who is the Toronto-based author of 4 novels, Stealing Nasreen, 6 Meters of Pavement, All-Inclusive, and her latest titled 7. 7 was just named an Indigo Chapter's Best Book of the Year and Amnesty International Readers 2020 Choice. Farzana is also the Masi behind Dear Masi, a new sex and relationships column for female genital mutilation or cutting survivors. She's also an activist, part-time psychotherapist, and amateur tarot card reader. So Farzana, welcome to Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Salima.
Oh, I'm so excited. Let's have this raw conversation and see what happens.
Yeah.
So, as you know, this podcast is all about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether directly about mental health, like a mental health struggle or something else. And we know that no matter the story, there's always an impact on one's own mental health in some way, which remains tucked away. And so this platform serves as a way to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society.
Mm-hmm.
So really here, encouraging people to share and tell what individuals typically have been reluctant to unveil. So I guess let's get started.
Wonderful.
Okay, so Farzana, to start, can you give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story? How would it read?
It might read something like, author and social worker Farzana Doctor writes a novel about Khatna in her community and breaks silence on a very taboo issue.
Wow. I mean, it's definitely telling, it's unveiling this progression of this journey that I'm eager to hear more about.
Thank you.
It sounds like you really nailed all the words of where it began to where you are today. Nicely put. Okay, so on that note, tell us what your untold story is all about.
Yeah, so I've been writing novels for many years now, and I'm also a psychotherapist. And in 2015, I joined a group called We Speak Out, and I became one of the founding members. And We Speak Out works in the Bohra community to end Khatna, or female genital cutting, in our community. And at that time, as my novelist brain was also being turned on, I found myself writing all these like fully formed fictional scenes that eventually became the first draft of the novel. And at the same time, activism was really intense, and I was also sorting through my own trauma around Kutna. So, as you can imagine, it was like a really emotionally intense moment in time: activism, novel writing, and my personal trauma sorting all at the same time.
Yeah, it's like all of your worlds colliding all in one.
Yeah, it felt like a storm, like it felt like a hurricane at the time.
Right, a hurricane. And so, to be honest, I think when I was maybe in high school or something a long time ago, where we might have learned a little bit, or I wouldn't say learned, but we might have been introduced to this idea of female genital mutilation, and it might have come up in like history courses or like social sciences or something. But I don't think that it might have just been an uncomfortable topic. So I think that I remember just shoving it away once we didn't have to talk about it anymore. But I don't think until more recently I became really aware of Kutna and FGM and survivors and what happens today. So this is all very still new for me.
Mhm. And it is a really uncomfortable subject for most people. You actually can feel it in your body as like a queasy feeling to talk about it. But what I've really found is that as we can normalize these conversations and put them within the continuum of other gender based violence, in the same way that we've been able to begin those conversations, we can start to do something about all of it. And it has been a really recent time in which we've been talking about it within a South Asian context as well. So while survivors from the African continent have been raising the alarm about this for, 20 to 30 years, it's only been since 2015 that within my own community, this became part of public discourse. So it's very new.
From 2015. Wow. Yeah,
Hmm.
that is very new.
From 2015. And also since 2015, like we're hearing people from all kinds of countries breaking silence, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, people from Russia and Colombia, and even white Christian women from the US, all breaking silence in the last few years.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, we're having a Me Too movement around FGM, which is really, really like hopeful to me.
It does sound hopeful. It really does. I mean, like I said, it wasn't even something that I knew so much about. So I can just only imagine how important it is to educate people and let people know more about it, as well as have movement, like solidarity in numbers, right?
That's right. And I think that once this does become more of a normalized conversation, we'll have a better chance of it ending. Like, I think until very recently, people thought of it as this weird kind of practice that weird people do from like weird countries. It was so othered.
Right.
But I think once we make it not an othered conversation, the governments will take more action, more feminist groups will get on board, and so on.
Right. Yeah, no, it definitely is something that we need to be able to have more exposure to so that the conversations, as you said, become more normalized so that we can actually talk about it without feeling like there's an elephant in the room.
Hmm.
I really, really hear what you're saying.
Hmm.
And so, would you say that breaking the silence was part of the mission of writing your captivating book, Seven?
Yeah, when I realized I was writing a novel, I knew that there was going to be an activist mission. But as a novelist, I'm really interested in writing a good novel, a page turning novel, a novel with strong characters and plot and all of that. So
Hmm.
I kind of put that hat on first.
Hmm.
so that I would write a novel that people would want to read, first of all, because I knew that this was a really hard premise to talk about Khatna.
Yeah.
So I tried to blend, the activist stuff in a way that would be digestible for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So it was part of my mission. And it's interesting how this book has really become a vehicle for me to do awareness raising. Like every time I, have a book club meeting or I'm at a festival or any book promotion activity, I would say what ends up happening is 30% of the conversation is about the characters in the book and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And 70% of the conversation ends up being about Khatna. And I'm quite pleased about that because really there's been so much silence in Canada around this issue. And, there's a few like key messages that I've been able to get out there that I think are really helpful. Like, for example, that it happens in 92 countries across the globe.
92 countries?
Yeah.
Holy moly.
And counting, because
Wow.
I mentioned we're having this Me Too movement, I think that number is just going to grow. And we estimate that in Canada, there's probably something like in the neighborhood of 100,000 survivors.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that, like, somebody at your workplace, somebody at your school, somebody in your neighborhood is a survivor of this practice. And then all these girls all around the world are at risk. Like, it's estimated that every 10 seconds, a girl or non binary child is cut.
Wow. I don't
Yeah.
even know what to say because these are stats and information that I have never, been exposed to or spoken about or introduced to. So it just seems like really like it puts me like obviously I'm sitting in with a lot of discomfort right now, but I'm in a lot of disbelief. I believe everything you're saying, but I'm in
Yes.
disbelief of like, wow, that is a practice that's happening in so many places to so many people.
Yeah, it is a bit shocking.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really shocking. You can tell from my expression here.
Yeah, and I imagine that a lot of your listeners would be shocked by this. And, I think I was thoroughly shocked by all of this too. I've been doing a lot of learning since, 2015, only 5 years.
Right.
And so now I'm no longer shocked. And I really see this as like a systemic issue of just how women are and non-binary people, and I'm making it very clear I'm saying non-binary people because some of the survivors are
Mhm.
non-binary or
Mhm.
even trans men now.
Mhm.
I really feel like our sexuality has been so suppressed and so shamed, and it's so unnecessary.
Mhm. Yeah, it is so unnecessary. Farzana, can I ask you, for the sake of our listeners, like, we're talking about Khatna in general. If you could talk a little bit more about in your community, like what would happen to how would that happen? Like how does that
Hmm.
um
How does it work?
yeah, how does it work? What happens there?
Yeah. So in the Bohra community, and there are differences among communities,
Mhm.
but there are also similarities. So I'll tell you what the similarities are as I talk. But
Right.
it happens around the age of 7 in the Bohra community, plus or minus a few years. And it generally happens. The kids are taken to an amateur cutter or sometimes to a doctor, often under false pretenses. So the kid will be told, we're going to a party or we're going for ice cream or, something like that.
Right.
And then this very kind of like shocking, confusing thing happens, usually with a lot of gaslighting messages around it that are similar to other forms of sexual abuse. So
Mhm.
kids are told, don't talk about this. And anyway, nothing really happened.
Mhm.
Within my community, they think of it as a religious right, a religious requirement in
Mhm.
order to make girls sexually pious. And so they're told often, oh, it's just a little nick. It's usually the clitoral
Mhm.
hood that is
Mhm.
cut, but there's no standardization. So I know some survivors will say that they had like a very minor cut where there's no scarring or anything. Other people have had some minor scarring. Some people have had major scarring. Some people have had major nerve damage.
Right.
Because remember, we're talking about like tissue that is very tiny on very small people,
Right.
right? And often this is done by like an amateur.
Yeah, and amateur cutters, so they don't necessarily have the best tools.
That's right. So a really delicate tissue can really be damaged. And I think what a lot of survivors within the Bora context will talk about is really a lot of psychosexual trauma that happens.
Okay.
So, having difficulty trusting people,
Hmm.
freezing up during sex, not having much pleasure in sex, lots of pain sometimes that isn't like directly connected to the cut, but is more connected to the ways in which our bodies will hold tension and trauma.
Hmm.
So that's often what happens. But in other communities, the damage can be much worse because there's four different types of FGM, and in the Bohra community, it's considered to be type 1 or type 4. But there's type 2 and type 3, which involve more extensive cutting.
Wow. And I guess maybe for some women, like when you mention about the trauma and how it impacts them, with issues around trust and pain and freezing when they are encountered with, being sexual or, anything to do with their sexuality or anything that they're looking at, there must be like at some points like repressed memories for some, would you
Yeah.
say?
Yes, and for me, it was a repressed memory that really came up, and I had to sort it through. And I was in a very privileged position to do that as a therapist, and as a therapist who does trauma therapy, and also as someone who had access to all of these activist networks and information. So I was in a very privileged position. But even for me in that position, I encountered a lot of self doubt,
Hmm.
confusion. It took quite a bit of time for me to be able to piece everything together. So yeah, it's quite a process.
So it really sounds like you having gone through this yourself, like you really have been impacted in a number of ways, just like the others. I mean, yes, you've had the tools as a therapist, as a psychotherapist to help you get through, but I'm sure that there wasn't a moment that was easy for you either.
Yeah, it was really difficult, and like there were moments where I had nightmares, I had body memories,
Hmm.
I would have like inexplicable kinds of mood shifts. And again, as I was trying to make sense of this, I think the hardest part is that, there is all of this gaslighting that happens around the traumatic moment. So I would say the most painful thing was not the actual traumatic moment, but all of the confusion and gaslighting and shame that came from that moment,
Hmm.
which is very common to other sexual abuse survivors.
Yeah, that is a common theme that I have heard from victims and survivors as well.
Hmm.
So, thank you so much for being able to, share so clearly some of the details of how you've been impacted. I mean, it's hard stuff to talk about, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's getting easier with time. When I first started looking at being more public about all of this, I was very frightened.
Mhm.
And I think it was because I wasn't ready. I hadn't done enough therapy.
Mhm.
But as time has passed, I can talk about this pretty comfortably, and I know it's because there's a purpose to it. I know that this will probably help other people.
Right. Yeah, definitely I hear the purpose in what you're sharing for sure. So, Farzana, if I could ask, what part of your journey would you say that you're in? So, would you say that you are looking back, in the middle, or just getting started?
I think of myself as being in the middle because I don't know what else is to come. Trauma is strange, right? There's even a book called
Mhm.
Trauma is Strange.
Mhm.
Um, so I know that I'm not at the very beginning in those very confusing early moments. And maybe I'm middle to looking back, with some of it.
Mhm.
But I am very curious about where all of this is going to take me. I hadn't expected to be somebody who is doing public speaking about Khatna, and now I'm doing it, and I see the purpose in it.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, like, where that's all going to lead after this book has been out a while, and I'm no longer actively promoting it. What will be my role in terms of this whole FGM journey? I'm really enjoying being an advice columnist,
Yes.
so that's really fun.
Dear Mossy.
Yes, I look for activism that gives me some joy.
Mhm.
So I know that I'm not going to be an activist that sits on a steering committee like I have done that in the past. I find that so not fun.
Right, right.
Even though I love my comrades, I don't enjoy that kind of activism as much, especially on this
Mhm.
issue. So, perhaps one day I'll do just a little more training and maybe I'll focus my private practice to work with survivors of FGM. I don't know. I don't know. So that's why I would say I'm in the middle.
Okay. And so being in the middle here with everything else that you just shared, what do you want to remember about the process of your healing journey?
Um, I think I want to remember that it took time,
Mhm.
it took patience.
Mhm.
I didn't have to know everything all at once. I didn't have to remember everything all at once. So I think it's just like having a lot of self compassion for the process.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Self-compassion is really very important for having our own processes for sure. You mentioned all of these different places that you're involved in with activism and different things that you've done along the way over the years. So at this moment, I know you've been talking a little bit about, what you might do in the future and what that looks like and how that, you might take training or you might decide to niche in or you might do something else. But at this moment, what would you say is your healing signature?
I would say that as a therapist,
Hmm.
I am somebody who really loves the spiritual and I love weaving the spiritual in.
Hmm.
I also love weaving the somatic in. I
Hmm.
used to be somebody like I used to do CBT ages ago. And while I can do it, and sometimes it's good to add that in,
Hmm.
I really find that people do much better healing when they can connect to their bodies,
Right.
they can connect to their imagination, they can connect to their spirituality. So I like doing parts work,
Right.
internal family systems therapy type of stuff.
Hmm.
I love doing attachment based work. I really love hypnosis.
Right.
Yeah, and I love having really deep conversations with people about spirituality and how their spirituality works in their healing.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like a great signature. And it really is all encompassing, but it really speaks volumes to the transformation of your work, and the colliding of your worlds, both like in what you've experienced, your healing, and how you help heal others, right?
Yeah, and I think the other piece is that I do like the colliding of worlds.
Hmm.
When I first started as a social worker, this was before social media. Then social media arrived, and we had all these discussions about how maybe we shouldn't be on social media because we were supposed to remain kind of like hidden, or we weren't supposed to show our personal lives. And I started publishing books in 2007. So that became impossible.
Hmm.
Suddenly, my world started to collide, right? Because
Right.
clients would hear about my books, they would buy my books, they would read my books, they would, listen to podcasts.
Hmm.
So I used to have a lot of discomfort about the worlds colliding. And now I really think that the more authentic we are in all of those areas, the better we are. So I'm
Hmm.
a much better therapist allowing the worlds to collide. And of course, I still have to be mindful of boundaries and all of that. But I no longer have to say I'm, a writer in this world and a therapist in this world and an activist in that world. I think all three of them can come together.
I agree. It's funny you mention the whole part about, operating as a therapist, like from a manual. That's kind of what I thought about when you were just speaking right now. The idea of like boundaries. Yeah, boundaries are very important in a therapist client relationship. But I really like how you've emphasized the colliding of the worlds, right? So there's all parts of us, right? And so if we embrace all parts of ourselves, we're actually encouraging others to embrace all parts of themselves as well.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that we can't be clear with our boundaries while still owning it all.
Yes, yes. And I think probably there are ways that our traditional colleges and our traditional education get in the way of all of that. And, I hope one day these very conservative and mainstream ways of working turn themselves over.
There is hope. I have hope. Yes. So, Farzana, in one of your written interviews, you talked about diminishing the feminine. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think patriarchy is still very much alive and well. And probably for most people who live in the West, they would say it's pretty subtle, but I would say it's subtle and everyday, like it's just in our air at this point. So when I talk about FGM, I'm talking about it being on a continuum of gender-based violence that's not that different from rape culture, that's not that different from the ways that, young girls are made to feel terrible about their bodies, in the ways that, homophobia and, transphobia exist,
Mm-hmm.
in the ways that we're still earning 73 cents on the dollar. So
Right.
it's all about diminishing women, non binary people, the feminine. It's still very much alive and well.
Mm-hmm.
And we sometimes don't realize that we enforce these things as women as well. Mona El Tahawi talks about how sometimes we are foot soldiers of the patriarchy without even knowing it.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're explaining it, it makes a lot of sense that, it could be in our subconscious mind and we operate in a certain way and it's a knee-jerk reaction or a habit and we don't realize where it's coming from and what it's directing, right? So
Yes, yes.
that's a really important viewpoint that I don't know that I really paid as, I wouldn't say that I didn't pay as much attention to, but certainly the way you framed it, it makes it very easy to connect with the patriarchal abuse.
Mm. Yeah, we have so much unlearning to do, right? It's going to take some
Hmm.
time. I mean, I don't know how long. There's like these terrible estimates of how long it's going to take for
Hmm.
us to move from like 73 cents to a
Hmm.
dollar. Like, I
Right.
think it's like 30 years or something or more.
That's a lot of years still. Yeah, we have a ways to go then. Hmm. So let's spin things around a little bit. At this time, what would you say that you're grateful for with encountering this journey of Khatna and this journey of seven and
Mhm.
your worlds colliding in this way?
In terms of doing my own trauma work, while it has been hard, I also feel like it's like finding a missing piece of a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And there's satisfaction and comfort in finding that missing piece. I found myself looking back over time and thinking about, early relationships and reactions to things and ways that I maybe kept myself small, and thinking about what might be some of those connections to Kutna.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just something really wonderful about learning about yourself and becoming more and more aware of yourself. So, I see it as quite a liberation that in my late 40s, I could do that work.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I probably couldn't do that work until then. Like, that was probably the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It takes time to get to that place of being able to do that
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
work, that deep work.
And, I think that we're probably, through our socialization, we're probably trained not to really understand ourselves very well. We're trained to honor other people's opinions versus our own intuition and our own self-understanding. So it takes a long time, I think, sometimes for us to be able to reclaim all of those puzzle pieces. And I'm sure there's so many more to go.
Yeah, it's so interesting how we're so easily influenced by people around us and what they say or do, and how it's so easy for an individual like you or myself to choose that over our own initial process. So, like as you said, our own intuition.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, it takes a lot of work and help and support and all of that to be able to get and reclaim another puzzle piece.
Sure. And so, with regards to mental health, right? You've talked a little bit about some of the impacts to mental health a few minutes ago, but what would you say that you've experienced specifically that impacted your mental health as you went through this journey?
Like, what was one of the most helpful things that I did around my mental health?
I guess more about how your mental health was impacted from all of this. I know you mentioned earlier about the decoding and how there was this idea of how you would come out the other end, right? So just I guess how was it for you on the mental health front?
Mm. Well, I would say that at the beginning of the process, my mental health probably tanked quite a lot
Mhm.
as I
Mhm.
was, working through all of that. And then ease arrived. I noticed like sometime in the beginning of August or something, as I was getting ready to promote Seven,
Mhm.
I noticed that I had a renewed sense of courage. And then, probably by my second interview in September, I realized, oh, this isn't so hard. People's questions
Mhm.
don't feel intrusive. This feels like a major opportunity to be able to talk about something so important. So there has been this shift from 2015 to 2020.
Mhm.
And I would say that, like, even my mental health is much better in 2020 compared to 2014 before I started looking at all of this. Because that major puzzle piece, like, there was a dip and then a rise, but the rise is higher than when it started
Mhm.
because this
Right.
puzzle piece is so important to me.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I really like how you're able to explain that shift, right? So, like when you talked about how you were able to see it as an opportunity in your interview versus before, maybe, that threat or the discomfort of like having to talk about it from such an angle, but you're shifting of like, oh, it's an opportunity. So it kind of opened you up. Like you just felt open,
Hmm.
like an open place.
I really now welcome these kinds of conversations,
Hmm.
where before I would have said I was bracing myself for them.
Yeah, I guess once you open to this, you're fully open. So it gets easier and easier each time you open to continue that path.
Yes, that's right.
And so, did your book just spool out on its own, or did you have to go through a sorting process to try and figure out how to have it manifest?
Yeah, I would say that the first 20 scenes or so just unspooled into a notebook.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I transferred them to my computer and started thinking about plot details and setting details and what did I want these characters to do and where was the book going to go, that's when there was major revision, major editing, major like thinking of how to make it work.
Okay.
And I had lots of support. I had beta readers, I have an agent, I had an editor, and all of those people really helped to make it into the kind of polished end result that I have for it.
Right. So, starting with all that hurricane, just all coming together, and then sorting through it and having your polished final end product. That's really great. That's really great.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm really I just want to say about the
Yeah.
book, one thing that I'm really pleased about. So it's been out 3 months now in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and it's done really well in Canada. Like it ended up on like 7 or 8 end of the year best books lists for 2020.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
That's great.
And I'm hearing all kinds of people reading about it, and there's something really thrilling about a book that has this difficult premise
Mhm,
and about a really taboo subject that only came out into the light a few years ago,
mhm,
that so many people are reading it and they're saying, I read it really quickly. It was a page turner. It was funny, even like I don't know. I'm just really thrilled that this subject that I couldn't even talk about easily to myself in 2015 is now a book
mhm.
that people are reading.
It's amazing, and it sounds like all the self-awareness that you've cultivated around this, to care and be and do has just come through so well through this process and writing your book and claiming and coming out with, yeah, this is something that I went through also. And now I'm becoming an activist and I'm writing about it and now I'm telling about it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's been a good process in the end. I wouldn't have imagined back in
Mhm.
2015 that I would write a novel about it, that I would be here talking to you about all of this. I
Right.
wouldn't have imagined it.
And so, yeah, I guess you didn't imagine it, but here you are. You're doing it all.
Hmm.
And so, Farzana, what would be your key message to listeners of our show?
I would say that if you've got something that is a really silenced, taboo, shameful subject in your life, start opening it up and
Mhm.
do it with support, do
Mhm.
it carefully.
Mhm.
Therapists, friends, fellow activists, all of those things are important in the journey, partners, everybody,
Mhm.
open it up and see where it goes. Perhaps you want a creative outlet for it, but open it up.
Right. And do you have a message to Khatna survivors?
Yeah, I would say take your time, be patient with yourself. Don't get pressured into taking up space in the activist spotlight until you're ready. There can be a lot of pressure because there's so
Mhm.
much to do, right, around this issue.
Right.
I felt a lot of pressure a couple of
Right.
years to move into the spotlight and come out as a survivor. Yeah,
I'm sure it feels overwhelming.
it totally was overwhelming when I started doing it back then. I would not sleep that night. I would be wrecked for a couple of days if I spoke. So
Mm.
I would say be careful with yourself, be mindful about what's going on in your own body, have the adequate support. And if you choose not to be an activist around this, that's okay too.
Mhm.
It's not for everyone.
No, being an activist is not necessarily for everyone, and being an activist can be something different to each person as well, right?
That's right. My 96-year-old grandmother, my nanny,
Mhm.
agreed to be photographed and have her photographs used in some of our social media campaigns for We Speak Out.
Oh, that's excellent.
So my nanny's not an activist. She's not an activist, but she
She's
has
showing up.
changed. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
showing up. She's changed her views
Mhm.
about all of this over time. She's listened
Mhm.
and she's showing up. So that's an example.
That is a great example. And thank you for sharing that example with me. And I also really appreciate these solid words of wisdom because I'm certain that this will be very helpful to all listeners, Khatna survivors, and listeners in general.
hmm I would say that, the process that I went through is not that different to anyone who's delving into trauma that they need to
Right.
work on.
Yeah. It's just trauma that we're working on, right?
That's right. And we all have it.
We all have it. And so, Farzana, I'm curious about what is your game changer inspiration that's close to you that reflects your untold story? So, is there like a quote or a book or something that speaks to you?
There's a person.
Mm-hmm.
So, how I got involved in We Speak Out was there was a woman named Massima Rinaldi. She's an activist who lives in Delhi, and she wrote her own first person survivor story in the mainstream media in India. And that article started moving around on social media, and I saw it on Facebook. And I reached out to her, through Messenger just to say thank you to her for writing her story. And she invited me to join a WhatsApp group that evolved into We Speak Out. And
That's so cool.
she changed my life. Just that she had enough courage. She was the
Mm-hmm.
first that I saw anyway.
That's a very memorable experience. And also, just, I'm guessing you weren't really expecting a response from her, right? So,
Yeah, I wasn't, because often you don't, get respect. We weren't Facebook friends or anything like that. So,
right.
and I wasn't even sure I wanted a response, but I felt so
Yeah.
moved to reach out to her. You know how sometimes there's just this invisible hand pushing you forward.
Yeah. It just resonates and you're gravitating towards it. It's just a pull.
Yes. And so I was meant to meet her. I was meant to reach out to her and I was meant to follow her lead.
Mm-hmm. So I guess some things are just meant to be, right?
Oh, I think so. Absolutely.
And so, what is a cause or organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you'd like to give a shout out to?
I'd like to mention two, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So, the group that I'm talking a lot about is called WeSpeakOut.org.
Okay.
People can find that on, the internet. And then in Canada, I helped to start a network because in
Mm-hmm.
Canada, the government has done almost nothing around FGM. And the network is called the End FGMC Canada Network. And people can Google
Mm-hmm.
that too. On social media, you can find it at Canada FGM. And that's an organization that I hope lots of people will join. You don't have to know a ton about this issue. Maybe you just have an interest in doing something about it. They have a great mailing list. They encourage people to take part in whatever way they can, at your workplace, through a lunch and learn, whatever they can do. On February 6th, which is the International Day for the
Mhm.
Elimination of FGM, or for zero tolerance for FGM. That's it, zero tolerance. Um, yeah, so join the End FGM Canada network, and you can also follow on Instagram. That handle is End FGM Canada.
Okay.
So I would say just get involved, and there's some petitions you can find on the Twitter page. There's lots of things you can learn. Yeah.
Mhm. Awesome. These are both
Mhm.
amazing that you're sharing We Speak Out as well as the NFGMC Canada Network. That's really important and inspirational that you've been able to develop this here in Canada. And hopefully it gets the exposure that it needs and people continue to find a way to be involved in whatever way is comfortable for them.
Mhm. Thank you so much for all of this.
Yeah. I guess what I wanted to ask is like, you've given a lot of information to people about how they can get connected and how they can contribute. What if there was anyone, like if people needed to like connect with you, if they felt they wanted to connect with you directly, is there a way for them to do that?
I'm findable on social media just under my name, Farzana Doctor. And that's probably the best way. I also have a website. That's just farzanadoctor.com.
Excellent. FarzanaDoctor.com. Wow. Now that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for just doing this podcast. Like, that's a really wonderful initiative on your part. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.